Welcome everybody to this one of our early events of the year that is sponsored by the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. I'm delighted to have you all here. I thought before I introduce our speaker, I would tell you a little bit, just to point you over there to some of the little flyers of other events we're having. I'm Catherine Ewing. I'm currently the director of the Institute. And we have a number of events coming up in October. So I'm just going to quickly mention those. We have in October 6th, we have Kabir Tamar, who is an anthropologist from Stanford, who will be speaking on declarations of friendship, nonviolence, and the concept of the political in the Middle East. On October 13th, we have a panel conversation on the origins of neoliberalism. I won't go into the details because I don't want to take too much time, but you can see them all. And then October 17th, another panel on religion and the vote, the role of faith in modern American elections. And then a talk on October 25th by Andrew Benjamin, What is Political Theology? And two talks on October 25th. I expect you to come to them all. Michael Barnett, The Star and the Stripes, The Foreign Policies of American Jews. But today, I'm really delighted to introduce somebody I've been working with closely on an edited volume on Sufism in South Asia that she's been helping me with. And this is Rosemary Corbett, who is a faculty fellow with the Bard Prison Initiative and received a PhD in religion from Columbia University, this department, with a focus on Islam in the United States. She's previously held positions as a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship, the Center for the Humanities at Tufts University, and most recently, a young scholar in American religion with the Center for the Study of American Religion at Indiana University and Purdue University. Her research involves examining how racial and religious minorities navigate U.S. Protestant-derived norms by forming shifting alliances around civic or political issues. She has a forthcoming book, Making Moderate Islam, Sufism, Service, and the Ground Zero Mosque Controversy, hence our ties over thinking about Sufism. And just to summarize that very briefly, drawing on a decade of research into the community that proposed the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, Corbett refutes the idea that current demands for Muslim moderation have primarily arisen in response to the events of 9/11, or to the violence often depicted in the media as unique to Muslims. Instead, she places such demands in the context of decades of pressure on religious and racial minorities to conform to dominant American frameworks for race, gender, and political economy. This book will be available in November from Stanford University Press, so run out and buy it.
Or pre-buy it.
You can probably order into Amazon right now. In addition to this book and works in edited volumes, she has publications that have appeared under two names, Rosemary Corbett and Rosemary Hicks, in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, the journal Religion, the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture, American Quarterly, Comparative Islamic Studies, and the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. Her talk today, which is Making Moderate Islam in America, the History Behind a Contemporary Debate, addresses one of the arguments in her book. So please join me in welcoming Rosemary.
Thank you, Kathy, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm so pleased with this turnout, and it's really nice to get to talk about research that I undertook while I was a graduate student here that's now coming out in book form, so this is exciting for me. And despite my concerns when I graduated and didn't get the book out that same year that the timeliness of this research would diminish, this research on the makings of moderate Islam, which is around the 10th anniversary of 9/11, we've unfortunately seen that the relevance of it has not diminished at all, and in fact is still quite timely. We just passed, as you know, the 15th anniversary of 9/11, and in fact we see debates about Muslim moderation have not gone anywhere, or I should probably say they haven't gone anywhere good. If you saw the New York Times this week, I think it was a Sunday, but it might have been a Monday article, you probably noticed that violence against Muslims and hate crimes are at an all-time high since 9/11. And as I was going to mention, we thought they were at an all-time high during the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and had no idea that that trend would continue. But part of the reason it continued was because of, and part of the reason it was so high then was because of the controversy around what became known as the Ground Zero Mosque. And so that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today. In fact, one of the primary things. So just to refresh your memory, and excuse me if I sound winded throughout, I have very little lung capacity at this point. But just to refresh your memory, in December of 2009, Faisal Abdul Rauf announced plans to open a 13-story Islamic community center in downtown Manhattan. You probably didn't hear about it till the following summer, but it was December of 2009 that the New York Times first picked it up. So a prominent imam, Sufi sheikh, and the internationally recognized leader of the Cordoba Initiative, which was an organization he founded in 2004 to, quote, heal the divide between Islam and the West, Rauf designed Cordoba House, which is the original name of the community center, to educate non-Muslim Americans about the truths that he feels Islam shares with other faiths. And he also designed it to exemplify the moderate Islam, and those are his words, that he'd spent nearly a decade promoting. Most notably in his 2004 book, What's Right with Islam? A New Vision for Muslims in the West. Can everybody hear me in the back? Just checking? Okay, great. So in that book, in Friday messages he delivered at his mosque in Tribeca since 2001, and in public appearances sponsored by the US State Department, among other places, Rauf defined Muslim moderation by translating Islamic traditions in terms of American idioms. His primary message is that Islam is part of an ethical tradition originating with Abraham, the biblical patriarch common to Judaism and Christianity as well, and that of all the governments in the world, American liberal democracy best embodies this ethic in social form. More specifically, because US multiculturalism, pluralism, and what he was calling democratic capitalism are expressions of this Abrahamic ethic, in his opinion, an ethic that he argues also characterized the interreligious Spanish 12th century city of Cordoba. US laws and institutions comply with Islamic law, or Sharia. Consequently, non-Muslim Americans can accept Muslims as Abrahamic siblings, and moderate Muslim Americans who recognize these commonalities can promote American liberal values and social systems worldwide. So both local leaders and international elites, ranging from Rauf's World Economic Forum colleagues to the Archbishop of Canterbury, had widely praised his message of Abrahamic commonality after 9/11. Consequently, the imam did not expect significant opposition to Cordoba House when he made the announcement in 2009. And indeed, for a while, many religious, political, and financial leaders responded positively to the project, and the Manhattan Community Board approved it. And the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, or LMDC, was very excited about granting funds. But others, especially politicians practicing using fear of Islam for electoral gain, denounced the center as a ground zero mosque, turning it and Rauf's claims of moderation into subjects of international debate. And I'm not going to go into this right now, but you can ask me in Q&A if you want how this is possible. Citizens United was actually directly related to this. Or I should say the impact of Citizens United was partly responsible for this. So the controversy intensified in the summer of 2010, which is when most people first heard about it. While Rauf was on a State Department-sponsored cultural outreach tour in the Middle East, New York Republican Congressman Peter King claimed that he only posed as a moderate and should be investigated for ties to radical Islam. And if you don't remember, the next year, King went on to hold congressional hearings, a series of them, onto Muslim radicalization in the United States. And this is despite the fact that since 2009 at least, the Department of Homeland Security was saying, Muslim Americans don't actually represent the greatest threat of violence in the United States, white militant movements do. So that actually, Janet Rita retracted that report after it came out, but Peter King went ahead with his plans anyway. But King was not the first public official to castigate the imam this way. He followed both Tea Party leader Mark Williams, who called the Islamic Community Center a shrine to the terrorist monkey god, and later apologized to Hindus after some criticism. And believe it or not, only to Hindus, yes. And Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, who was then an aspiring presidential candidate. Casting aspersion on the center, Gingrich argued that the medieval city of Cordoba did not signify religious coexistence, but Islamic conquest over Christian kingdom, something that he argued that Muslims wanted to repeat in the United States. And such accusations prompted Sharif El-Gamal, the project's developer and also one of Rauf's Sufi dervishes, to rename the project from Cordoba House to Park 51, which was after its street address, 51 Park Street. Not surprisingly, nevertheless, Gingrich likened building Cordoba House to placing Nazi signs near Holocaust memorials or to erecting a Japanese cultural center near Pearl Harbor. Now, as many pundits have observed, the discourse around the community center was highly politicized, and it was generally very partisan. And this was something that really surprised Rauf, because he had spent the better part of a decade working with both Republicans and Democrats. In fact, he worked with Karen Hughes, Bush's Undersecretary of State at one point, for quite a while, long before he ever worked with the Obama State Department. And officials from both administrations considered him an ideal moderate spokesperson, which almost seems impossible to imagine at this point of political polarization and this point of using Islam for electoral gain. So how is that possible? So if you want to go get the book, I'll discuss the three primary facets of Rauf's definition of Muslim moderation, which was lauded by politicians of all stripes before 2010. And I'll talk about one of these facets today. Specifically, though, I focus in the book on how all of these facets are highly racialized and gendered in different ways, although Rauf has not always been aware of the racial history or the ramifications of his definitions. Now, I've written about and discussed elsewhere two of these components in articles as well as the book. First, the older Orientalist idea that Sufism is the peaceful, apolitical, nonviolent strain of Islam. And second, the more contemporary idea that engaging in community service projects will help Muslims to prove their moderation and Americanness against the specter of violent extremism, just as community service projects helped Catholics and Jews demonstrate, not that Catholics aren't Christians, but just to be specific, Catholics and Jews demonstrate their Americanness and overcome nativist discrimination in the past. And you probably recall, of course, that providing community services was one of the points of the downtown community center. And it was a successful selling point for local politicians and community boards until the rise of the Tea Party during the midterm elections of 2010. And I want to leave time to talk about those other aspects today and the politics of them in the Q&A if anyone is interested, as well as time to talk about what actually happened with the Islamic Community Center. But those are not the things that I'm going to focus on right now. At the moment, I want to put contemporary calls for Muslim moderation in a larger context, showing how they are related, of course not identical, to historic pressures on other religious and racial minorities to conform to dominant US mores. And what I'll focus on specifically is US political economy. And some of the ways Muslim Americans have volunteered to, I should say some Muslim Americans, or been conscripted into defending a particular model of political economy, a model that, like other aspects of moderation I mentioned, has deeply racial and gendered ramifications. So as an entree into this subject, let me tell you how I got interested in the research that I did and the questions about political economy that I pursued. I first heard Rauf speak at Riverside Church in 2004, which I can see right now through the window. As many of you know here, Riverside was financed by John D. Rockefeller Jr. and over the decades has seen visitors as diverse as Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Fidel Castro, Kofi Annan, Dick Cheney, and Hillary Rodham Clinton. And in fact, the first time I visited, Cheney and Clinton were on the same stage and the world didn't come to an end, which may surprise everybody. Miracles do happen. Because I'd long been curious about the ways Americans combine ideas about religious and national belonging, particularly as they do so in narratives of Judeo-Christian civilization and heritage, which is itself a 20th century invention. I first visited the church in 2003 for New York City's second annual September 11th Interreligious Memorial Service. And I noticed immediately that the service didn't include Muslims, although Muslims did, of course, die in the attacks, and Muslims were among the first responders after the attacks. The one caveat that might explain not including them is that they were not, as far as we know, members of the New York City Police Department or Fire Department who died in the attacks, who were the official people being memorialized at that time. Anyway, I also noticed that James Forbes, who was the senior pastor at the time, was very carefully interrupting the kind of Judeo-Christian language that people were using to distance Muslims from Americanness during that ceremony. So I wasn't entirely surprised the following March to find that a local imam was going to be speaking from Forbes' pulpit. And Rauf's message on the late winter morning that I first heard him in 2004 was that America's Judeo-Christian heritage, as I mentioned, is actually a trifold Abrahamic one, not just Catholic Protestant Jew, but Muslim Christian Jew. So fascinated by what was then getting to be more popular, but not quite as popular as it is now, that narrative, and curious as to whether he was saying the same thing at his mosque, and even more curious about how Muslims there were responding to it, I decided to accept the invitation he extended to the audience to go to the mosque in Tribeca, at which the mosque is named Masjid al-Farah, which he's no longer the imam of, but which still exists. Imam Faisal, as he's called there, or was called there, wasn't present during my initial visit 2 weeks later, but I found an assistant imam who actually is an emergency room doctor who was one of the responders to the 9/11 attacks, delivering a similar message about religious commonality the first time I went. And after the Friday prayer service, I told him and this 65-year-old Sufi convert, who I'm going to call Dean, but who often described himself as a Catholic boy from Brooklyn, even though he identified as Muslim as well. They spent the afternoon informing me about the ways that Sufism, for them, promoted interreligious harmony. And they also invited me to that evening Sufi zikr session in an Upper West Side apartment. And that's where I met other members of Rauf's Sufi group. So it was during the communal meal following zikr, which usually involves prayers and reciting portions of the Quran and chanting the attributes of God, among other things, depending on the order, that someone first handed me a promotional mock-up for his soon-to-be published book. And again, this is like March of 2004. The book didn't come out till, I think, May. And on the back was a little blurb that was later replaced by a quote from Karen Armstrong. And the blurb asserted that this American imam shows how Islam is compatible with American democracy and capitalism. And so I had no doubts about Rauf's sincerity or his intentions, but given my curiosity and questions about politics and narratives, I did immediately wonder about that promise and the politics that went with it. So I decided I wanted to learn more. And it wasn't long before I realized that this project would take several years, would consume my attention for the next several years. In fact, all of my doctoral research. Not only did I begin to research the history of Rauf's ideas and the political and economic philosophies to which they're connected, which I'm going to tell you about shortly, but I simultaneously began ethnographic work at the mosque on how Muslims there grappled with his teachings in their daily lives. And I continued that ethnographic work until 2011. So that took more time than I thought. Not that anybody should take 6 or 7 years for their PhD, but anyway. To be clear, I wasn't seeking definitive accounts of true Americanness or true Islam or true moderation, because of course there's no single definition of these things. These are all highly politicized concepts. But I was seeking to understand the pressures on Muslims to present themselves in certain ways after 9/11, and the creativeness that Muslim Americans exercised, as well as the difficulties they encountered in these circumstances. So given my questions about the pressures on Muslims to conform to certain templates and to reiterate certain narratives about American exceptionalism, what I discovered about the origins and the politics of Rauf's economic philosophy didn't surprise me greatly. And what did surprise me in 2010 was how difficult it was for Republicans, particularly Gingrich, to recognize, or I should say to acknowledge, how much they shared with the imam. Long active, just in case you don't remember who Gingrich is, I'm going to remind you, who could forget his illustrious history. Long active in trumpeting the nation's Judeo-Christian history, Gingrich led the Republican takeover of Congress on a family values platform in 1994. After he was charged with 84 counts of ethics violations, the former Southern Baptist retired from Congress in 1998 and pursued a new religious and political path. He converted to his third wife's Catholicism, and he founded Gingrich Productions to promote, quote, his vision, quote, of an America in which a belief in the Creator is once again at the center, end quote. And this vision characterizes his 2010 film, partly called about the dangers of radical Islam, called America at Risk, A War with No Name, as well as his 2010 and 2011 books called, first, To Save America, Stopping Obama's Secular Socialist Machine, and secondly, A Nation Like No Other, Why American Exceptionalism Matters. So between 2010 and 2012, Gingrich went to extraordinary lengths to condemn Cordoba House and the larger Abrahamic vision of America that it was meant to instantiate. And yet his rhetoric overstated his ideological differences with Rauf. Now, undoubtedly, Gingrich is more socially conservative than Rauf. Gingrich, in the 90s, twice proposed legislation that would grant to marijuana cultivators the death penalty. And Rauf is opposed to all forms of capital punishment. So there are significant differences in their approaches to social issues. But nevertheless, as I'll discuss, both Gingrich's and Rauf's philosophies, as they presented them in their works at this time, are liberal in three ways. They are liberal in terms of the Lockean liberalism evoked in the Declaration of Independence, which is fundamental to the way they set up both of their arguments. They are liberal in terms of the progressive era liberalism that viewed Protestant America as the triumphant culmination of world history, which is a theme that both of them modify to include Catholicism or Islam, respectively. And they're liberal in terms of the post-Great Society neoliberalism that stresses individual responsibility in the context of the privatization or repeal of state welfare provisions and government involvement in the economy, primarily on behalf of the market. This latter variety of market liberalism has often come to define the perspectives of politicians and pundits like Gingrich, who are more frequently called conservative. So about these commonalities. Even though Rauf describes American society as Abrahamic and Gingrich describes it as Judeo-Christian in culture and origin, they both define the nation's identity in terms of an exceptional quote-unquote American creed that is based on US founding documents, fortified by religious roots, and replete with economic implications. A closer look at this creed reveals the liberal philosophies of rights and neoliberal economic arrangements, including those in which community, or especially religious organizations, rather than the state, provide community and social services that are central to each man's story of America's progress and uniqueness. And meanwhile, a closer look at the history that led them to write these narratives illuminates how the racialized themes of service and anti-socialism have been central to religious minorities' struggles for acceptance since at least the mid-20th century, and I would argue before, but I'm not going to talk about before that today. So let's take a look at what they've written about this American creed. In his 2004 book, What's Right with Islam, Rauf mixes theology with history and sociology and psychology and biology and even game theory. And his argument is structured to demonstrate how US political norms evolved to fulfill Islamic or Abrahamic norms, or US political and economic systems evolved to fill Islamic or Abrahamic norms, which, for evidence of this Abrahamic American ethical convergence, he points, as I mentioned, to the nation's founding documents and to the liberal philosophies of reason, religion, and rights that they express. The Declaration of Independence and Constitution exemplify the core values of the Abrahamic ethic, he argues. Because the Declaration of Independence, quote, grounded itself in reason, just as the Quran and the Abrahamic ethic did, in asserting the self-evident oneness of God, it embodies the moral and philosophical worldview revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. So just to unpack that a little bit, because you're not going to get the whole chapter in which he explains it, this is a very modernistic syllogism in which oneness is synonymous with unity, which is synonymous with universality, which is synonymous with like natural law, the laws of the universe, scientific reasoning, that kind of thing. So he's, as I will explain, he's finding this commonality between what is revealed in the Quran that stresses the unity of God as opposed to the triune nature of God for Christianity, and the oneness expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Referencing the 3rd and the 30th chapters or surahs of the Quran, the Imam introduces readers to the Islamic concepts of nature, or al-fitra, and the religion or tradition of nature, depending on how you define that term, Deen al-Fitra, which he defines as natural religion. Rauf then compares these Quranic teachings on what he calls the Islamic tradition of natural religion with the declaration's mention of the laws of nature and of nature's God, concluding that the natural law referred to in the nation's founding documents is synonymous with what Muslims call Sharia. So for Rauf, Sharia is not just complementary to American values, it's actually based in the same mixture of reason and revelation that the founders were dealing with. So consequently for him, although no political society on earth will ever come as close to embodying Islamic precepts as the Prophet Muhammad's did, the US comes as close as possible and constitutes a Sharia-compliant state. Quoting Hamilton and Jefferson, and I swear if this starts to sound like a CC lecture, forgive me, I did teach CC, it'll be worth it, just hang in there. Quoting Hamilton, you were mostly graduate students, so you probably didn't have to take that, but quoting Hamilton and Jefferson on the divinely inspired laws of nature, Rauf posits that when the founders cited the God-given natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they adumbrated cardinal moral truths that all religious groups uphold. And because all Americans hold these founding tenets and rights in common, he believes, these values constitute the quote-unquote American creed, which is a peculiarly American form of the Abrahamic ethic to which, in his opinion, even atheists subscribe, because atheists subscribe through their moral assent and civic assent to the Declaration of Independence. Finally, Rauf argues that the divine law and the Declaration of Independence mandate certain economic arrangements, ones that he thinks are badly needed in the Muslim world. And these are free enterprise and a free market economy, which in his opinion, when coupled with individual rights and concern for the disadvantaged, quote, imply vigorous economic competition and high social mobility, end quote. Together, Rauf asserts, democracy and free market capitalism create a social environment that enables believers to live out the primary commandment that underlies all authentic religious traditions, and that is to love one's neighbor as oneself. And that's his reading, of course. And he believes that proof of this resides in American democratic capitalism, which, because it combines democracy with a free market economy, has fueled a historically unprecedented expansion of freedom and equality for all people. And you can hear, of course, the American exceptionalism in this analysis. Now, Rauf does acknowledge that Americans sometimes fail to live up to their founding ideals, and his 2004 book is not short on critique, be it the labeling of civilian casualties in Iraq as collateral damage rather than US state-supported terrorism, or US support for repressive regimes. But nevertheless, he forecasts that once Muslims and other Americans recognize their commonalities, they can jointly reorient wayward American practices back to the founders' original values and intentions, and jointly extend democratic capitalism around the world, which in his perspective, in his opinion, will undercut extremism, because he thinks extremism is not just a response to militant secularism, but also to material deprivation, and democratic capitalism would fix that. With these goals in mind, he explained in the book's final pages, he created the Cordoba Initiative. So 5 years after publishing this book, which was widely lauded, at least by the State Department officials I talked to, Republican and Democratic, Rauf announced plans to open Cordoba House. And less than a year later, the backlash was so severe that Roger Cohen of the New York Times rightfully noted, not since 9/11 has Islamophobia been at such a pitch in the United States. Now, of course, this backlash took several forms. Some of it was violence against Muslims, and that was taken to be Muslim, Sikhs, and generally Arabs and South Asians. And also the destruction or vandalizing of mosques and other Muslim-owned properties across the nation. So instead of this, some Americans also protested the expansion or creation of Islamic community centers elsewhere, from Tennessee to California to Staten Island. And others concentrated on combating the scenario that Gingrich was frequently warning against, which was the Muslim conquest of America, effected in part by replacing the Constitution with Sharia. Between 2011 and 2012, I think no less than a dozen states proposed legislation to ban the use of Islamic law in their territories. And when that was challenged as unconstitutional, they broadened it to the use of any religious law or any international law, which of course had consequences for Jewish law that was already accepted that they hadn't envisioned. It was very complicated. But nonetheless, as Cohen noted in his Times piece, Sharia is the new hot button wedge issue, as radicalizing as gay marriage or abortion, seized on by Republicans to mobilize conservative Americans against the supposed stealth jihad of Muslims in their midst, and against a Democratic president portrayed as oblivious to, or more importantly, complicit with, the threat. And the latest polls I saw, Hussein, you can, correct me if I'm wrong, 2014, 2015 was like 25% of Americans still believe that Obama is a secret Muslim. So it's unlikely that Gingrich failed to notice the political benefits of denouncing Cordova House or vowing to outlaw Islamic law during his multi-year campaign for the presidency. Admittedly, as I said, Gingrich's reasons for opposing Rauf could be attributed to significant policy differences, and this includes on the Middle East, where since at least the 90s, Gingrich has been very antagonistic toward Iran, and Rauf has long advocated building better relations with Iranian leaders. Nevertheless, what many people might find surprising are the ways that, and the extent to which, the premises of Gingrich's philosophy overlap with Rauf's. And this overlap is most evident in the ways Gingrich similarly attributes America's unique combination of religion, reason, and economic liberties to the American creed exemplified in the nation's founding documents. So a little bit from Gingrich, and then I'll give you the backstory on how these commonalities came about. Quote, "The ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the unique American identity that arose from a civilization that honored them form what we call today American exceptionalism." And that's Gingrich's argument from the intro of his 2011 book. And starting with his first chapter, which is devoted to outlining how the American creed, grounded in natural law, was forged from a mix of Enlightenment, reason, and religious devotion, Gingrich stresses the importance of recovering the ethos of the Revolutionary era. Only in so doing, he argues, can the nation avert impending disaster and prosper in what he thinks is the free market manner that the founders intended. The fact that Gingrich's creed, which I won't go into greatly today, closely resembles Rauf's is no accident, but it's also by no means intentional. Their commonalities stem from their reliance on common sources that are not immediately apparent because they don't cite the same authors in their analyses, the parts of their analyses devoted to liberal democracy or to US Republican history or even to economics. But focusing on the neoliberal economic principles that each derives from the American creed allows the individuals and institutions that influence their models of American exceptionalism to emerge and reveals a more complicated history of American religious minorities than their narratives acknowledge. And both argue that previous generations of religious minorities, specifically Catholics and Jews, Americanized and assimilated by creating voluntary organizations and contributing to society in ways that relieve the state of the burden of doing so. Although, of course, Gingrich is more strident about relieving the burdens of the state than Rauf is. For his account of the American creed and American liberal democracy, Rauf cites the Reverend Forrest Church, who, at the time that this book was published, was the senior minister of All Souls Unitarian Church on the Upper East Side. And Church had published over 20 books at this point, including one called God and Other Liberals. So it doesn't seem like it has very much in common with Gingrich, right? In 2002, he published a book called The American Creed, A Spiritual and Patriotic Primer, which is what Rauf cribs from. And in his preamble, Church notes the term's coinage, the term American Creed by G.K. Chesterton, who was this Englishman that visited the U.S. in 1921 and upon leaving argued that the U.S. is the, quote, only nation in the world founded on a creed, one set forth with theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. So maybe they're all just cribbing on Chesterton. Or maybe not. Maybe it's more complicated. I'll let you guess what I think. America's religious nature is something Church traces in part to John Locke's influence on the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights. In fact, Church opens the first chapter of his work with a quote from Locke's second treatise on government, in which Locke states that in the beginning, all the world was America, which is a statement he makes partly in service of his argument that all true and good governance is founded on the principles of natural law. While the Enlightenment religious values Locke expressed are crucial to the nation's founding frameworks, Church argues, they are not original. Rather, Locke drew his inspiration originally from Americans, specifically from William Penn, his friend who founded the colony of Pennsylvania and preceded Locke in arguing for natural rights to to liberty and property. This is Church's argument, and it's not an uncommon one. In addition to explicating Locke's natural law philosophies, Church refers to Jefferson and Hamilton, and the same quotes that he uses show up in Ralph's work later. And in subsequent chapters argues that the religious nature of the country may not be as specific as it initially seems, asserting that America is not a Christian nation. It is, however, a religious one, and that's very important for him, for all three of these authors. This attempt to resolve the tension between America's fundamentally influential religious heritage and its pluralist promise is something that all three of their narratives share. And what unites the country for all of them, despite diversity, and allows the nation's original values to cohere are what they think are the common ethics shared by Americans of all true faiths. Of course, depending on who you ask, which faiths get included in that might differ. For Church, the deistic influences of Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were crucial in forming, along with the American creed, a faith-based civic ethics that is pluralist and that transcends religious differences. And he argues that deistic thought that was so influential for Jefferson and Franklin adapted the core of Christian ethical value and kind of secularized it by tempering Christianity's authority. And it left in place what he believes Franklin advocated and what Raouf also emphasizes, which is a quote-unquote public religion that is more important than any single theological expression. Among the outcomes of this Protestant-derived ethic, and each author emphasizes the work habits that are supposedly central to it, are charity for Raouf and Church, and the voluntarism necessary to creating a robust civil society, in the words of Raouf and Gingrich. Now, Gingrich doesn't refer to Forrest Church, who wrote, as I said, God and Other Liberals, and he doesn't acknowledge Chesterton's coining of the term American Creed in his 2011 book. Yet, while Church is a religious leader that Gingrich would likely argue betrayed classical liberalism, which is something that contemporary conservatives of Gingrich's ilk often say about contemporary liberals who criticize aspects of free market capitalism. Some points of similarity in their books are actually striking, and not least of these is their common argument that the American Creed is rooted in the US religious orientation that preceded Locke and was subsequently developed in his writings, thus making Locke's revolutionary philosophy originally American. So this emphasis on Locke, this is, I swear, where this CC lesson is paying off. This emphasis on Locke is a recent development for Gingrich, and it's a really revealing one. Gingrich's thoughts on the US founding fathers changed following his conversion to Catholicism. Although he never mentioned Locke's natural law philosophy before that in any of his previous works on American civilization, and I will admit I skimmed them, a significant portion of his 2011 narrative is devoted to what he describes as Locke's Catholic-derived combination of reason with religious devotion, and he pulls in Aquinas here, and to the influence it had on the Declaration of Independence. This thinking can be traced to another author whose work is, with varying levels of attribution, fundamental to Raouf's, and that is the Catholic American pundit and conservative Michael Novak, who served as a diplomat under the Reagan administration, among other things. Gingrich credits Novak's 2002 book, On Two Wings, Humble Faith and Common Sense at America's Founding, with demonstrating Locke's relevance to the American experiment. And in that book, Novak likewise emphasizes the marriage of reason and religion in America's founding, cites the natural law frameworks of the nation's first apologists, and positions religious freedom as the right underpinning all others. So Novak is also intimately familiar with the author who coined the term American Creed. He wrote the introduction, in fact, to Chesterton's fifth volume of collected works. And in that 1987 essay, he compared Chesterton's concept of economic distributism with his own concept that he helped make famous, which is democratic capitalism. From the 1970s, which, in case you're getting warm and sleepy in this room, is what I opened with, that is pivotal to Ralph's philosophy of moderation. From the 1970s to the beginning of the 21st century, Novak's work on democratic capitalism at the American Enterprise Institute provided a theological basis for the neoliberal thought that emphasized individual responsibility in the context of free markets, free trade, and free people. Maintaining that no political economy on earth would ever match the ideals of the kingdom of God, which is something that he and his formerly socialist colleagues had once suggested, Novak promoted instead what he called democratic capitalism, and which he traced directly to Locke. Gingrich's 2010 and 2011 books include copious references to Novak's work at the American Enterprise Institute. In the acknowledgments of his 2010 book, Opposing Obama, Secularism and Socialism, for example, Gingrich thanked Novak personally for contributing intellectual insights to the project, and Gingrich, who was a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute for 12 years at that point, also thanked all the scholars and the funders and the research assistants who helped him to finish it. The next year, in 2011, he acknowledged his debt to Novak's 1983 book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, and to Novak's interpretation of Locke. Raouf, like Forrest Church, on whom he seemingly relies the most, cites Novak only once, hardly at all, quoting an opinion piece that Novak wrote for the New York Times to buttress his point that the unfinished business of the Muslim world in the West is religious in nature. Although Raouf's endnotes never mention Novak's 1983 treatise and don't mention any of Novak's economic writing at all, frankly, Novak's argument for the superiority of free market society, ostensibly based in religious freedom and the biblical ethic of neighborly love, over centralized economies such as those in the Muslim world or anywhere that there's socialism or communism, is replicated in every chapter of Raouf's book. And it's also at the heart of how Raouf defines the unfinished business of the Muslim world, implementing democratic capitalism in a way that is Sharia compliant. So although Raouf primarily cites Church's work on American history and the American creed and the American dream, his economic analysis derives from Novak. So how did that happen? I'm glad you asked. First, I want to note that Raouf's reliance on the work of both self-professed liberals and avowed conservatives doesn't need to be seen as contradictory necessarily, because unlike Gingrich and Church, he's not positioning himself on the poles of the political spectrum. He's claiming the middle way. He's claiming the path of the moderate. But tacking back and forth between extolling New Deal programs on the one hand and praising the cumulative effects of self-reliance and self-interest, his narrative exemplifies the difficulty of finding a coherent position that can be accepted at a time of increasing political polarization. He resolves this difficulty by pinning moderation to a form of practice that blends what he sees as the economic and entrepreneurialism of free market enthusiasts with the community consciousness of socially minded reformers. And for him, that practice is Sufism. If you want to know more about his particular interpretation of it, we can talk about that in the Q&A. What I want to focus on in the time that remains is how Raouf's use of Novak's work replicates and illuminates an earlier history in which religious minorities emphasized common civic ethics, including those of community service and market freedom, in order to claim American belonging. So back to Novak very briefly. Novak argued in 2010 that the American Republic more closely matches the Catholic vision of the good city than any prior civilization in history. And here you might hear Augustine. This is Catholic American exceptionalism, of course, and it's an argument he's had decades of practice making. During the late 1970s, with US foreign policy concerns divided in part between the petropolitics of the Middle East and the rise of liberation theology in Latin America, Novak led several meetings decrying liberation theology and promoting democratic capitalism at the American Enterprise Institute. Along with other former socialists such as Irving Kristol, Novak coordinated a multi-faith theological defense of the American Free Enterprise system, and AEI published the proceedings of one such conference, a 1979 conference, in a volume titled Capitalism and Socialism, a Theological Inquiry, which included contributions from Protestants, Catholics, and Jews on the necessary Judeo-Christian, still kind of a new term at that point, not new, but not as common as it is now, basis of a free and capitalistic society. So here we have this enactment of Judeo-Christian unity around neoliberalism in this volume. Not only did Novak and his colleagues attempt to demonstrate American capitalism's religious superiority at a moment when socialist movements seemed to proliferate among Latin American Catholics, they did so in a climate of domestic political backlash against civil rights legislation and new affirmative action programs that historians have labeled a late Cold War white ethnic revival. During that time, several socially conservative Catholic and Jewish intellectuals argued that true religion supported personal responsibility and market freedom, and depicted attempts to define social justice in economic terms or in terms of the redistribution of wealth as subversive and quote-unquote militant. In so doing, as one historian has observed, I'm quoting one, but there are many who have observed this, they affirm the place of Catholics and Jews of Eastern or Southern European heritage beside Anglo-Saxon Protestants, to the exclusion of other racial and ethnic groups, particularly Black Americans. And part of this process of affirming Catholic and Jewish whiteness involved echoing earlier 20th century Protestants' liberal narratives of American exceptionalism, but translating them into multi-religious, neoliberal ones. Just to give you a brief background, articulations of Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, or Judeo-Christian commonality hadn't really begun to take hold among white elites in the United States until after World War II. During the 19th century and early 20th century, in fact, as many of you probably know, Irish and Italian Catholics were often referred to in language that was similar or identical to what dominant Anglo-Saxon Protestants used to refer to blacks or freed slaves. And Eastern and Southern European Jewish immigrants frequently labored to distance themselves, not always, but often, from the black populations with whom they were sometimes grouped. Then, during the era of world wars, some Catholic and Jewish leaders attempted to widen the space afforded their communities in the US by contesting narratives that conflated progress with Protestantism and with Anglo-Saxon whiteness. And most, by no means all, but most, did so not by challenging the exclusions on which such progress was based. And by exclusions, I mean things like Roosevelt's compromise with Southern Democrats to exempt anybody who wasn't white from workers' rights legislation. So domestic work, mostly African American women, not covered. Farm work, mostly immigrants, not covered. These kind of things. So instead of contesting these racial underpinnings of progress, many of these immigrants and religious minorities, members of religious minorities, emphasize that their tradition supported that kind of progress too. And the upward economic mobility these white but ethnic immigrants experienced in subsequent generations, especially in the 1950s, due largely to the GI Bill, not exclusively but largely, whose education and housing provisions Black American veterans struggled to even access during a time of open institutionalized racism, seem proof of their claims that they were just as progressive and upwardly mobile and civilized and what have you as Anglo-Saxon Protestants. By the end of the 1960s, of course, civil rights, Black power, and third worldist movements had helped to transform immigration laws, understandings of culture and progress, and the very demographics of the United States. While many citizens seem to have something to gain from these changes, though, others believe they had possibly as much to lose, including their own tenuous claims to whiteness. As both multiculturalism and affirmative action policies proliferated, some formerly marginalized religious and ethnic elites who had benefited from government economic programs of the past began to stress that a leveled playing field of meritocracy, rather than affirmative action, was now the best way to manage disparity. And appeals to Locke and his ostensibly crucial influence on the nation's founders featured centrally in many of these narratives. And in the ways that these white ethnic, some of these conservative white ethnics tried to distance themselves from the specter of communism and socialism at home and abroad. This is despite the fact that, at least according to Bernard Bailyn, Locke's influence during the Revolutionary era was far surpassed by that of another Enlightenment figure, Montesquieu. But nonetheless, for free market enthusiasts, it's Locke who emphasized the divine rights of life, liberty, and property, which Jefferson then took and transformed in the Declaration of Independence into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 200 years later, with US economic arrangements seemingly under threat from without in the form of communism and socialism, and within in the form of affirmative action, these white ethnic intellectuals helped bring Locke's emphasis on private property and on divine rights to private property back in vogue. These new market liberals tended to depict the US as though, and this is a quote from Kenneth McIntyre that I love, it had, for better or worse, emerged fully formed from the forehead of John Locke. Some, such as Irving Kristol, also tended to lament what they saw as the demise of the Puritan work ethic and other religious values in modern life. So within this strange climate where you have political, cultural, and economic contestation, and Catholic and Jewish political conservatives calling for a return to America's foundational Protestant work ethic in order to limit the economic provisions of the state, that Muslim Americans, influential Muslim Americans, also begin translating Quranic precepts in terms of common ethics and market freedom. And one of those influential Muslim Americans was Faisal Abdul Rauf's father, Muhammad Abdul Rauf. Faisal Abdul Rauf's promotion of democratic capitalism and of Abrahamic ethics draws from his father's work of the 1970s, a decade in which Muhammad, who held degrees from Al-Azhar and from SOAS, or the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, served first as the director of the New York Islamic Center, before it was the big Islamic Cultural Center, and then of the very influential Islamic Center of Washington, D.C. During the 60s, prior to this, Muhammad Abdul Rauf and others of his colleagues created Arab-centered progress narratives, in which they invoked Arab modernists who based ethical frameworks and sometimes political and economic systems on the concept of divine tawheed, or oneness. And again, the syllogism is oneness, as exemplified in the Quran, is synonymous with universality, which is synonymous with modernity. So for them, Arab Islam is the most progressive spiritual force on earth, and it was Arab Muslims who had inaugurated modernity under the banner of Tawheed, which offers universal laws and ethics that they believe echo and even rival those of Christianity. In writing these narratives, Muhammad Abdul Rauf and his colleagues fit Islamic history into the structure of the European colonial progress narratives. And when I say colonial progress narratives, you should hear, when you hear unity and universality, you should hear the echoes of primitive religion, polytheism as primitive religion. They fit Islamic history into the structure of the European colonial progress narratives that early 20th century Protestant liberals, and later Catholic and Jewish conservatives, also adapted for American purposes. And not long after, they attempted to build on burgeoning Jewish-Christian alliances in the United States. And I'm going to focus on the 70s in the little that's left, but I will say that Muhammad Abdul Rauf started doing this as early as 1967 during the Six-Day War. He started going to synagogues in New York to talk with Jewish leaders long before there was ever this Jewish-Christian-Muslim kind of dialogue. He was actually quite a pioneer in that. But in 1979, fast forward a bit, during the escalating tensions wrought by the Iranian Revolution, Muhammad Abdul Rauf invoked interreligious commonality with a group of academics and theologians at that year's American Academy of Religion meetings in New York. And would that they would hold AAR meetings in New York now. But they don't. But instead of a Judeo-Christian dialogue, they called their Muslim-Christian-Jewish panels an Abrahamic trialogue. And this is really, as far as I can tell, the first time we see this usage in the US in a way that includes Muslims. There's a long colonial American history of using the term Abrahamic to refer to Christians who are superseding Jews and taking up the covenant, according to these theologians. But nobody used Abrahamic to include Muslims before this in the United States. And it was kind of following on Louis Massignon, if you know, French Orientalists of the 1920s through 40s. So this is when the term Abrahamic kind of gets re-injected, or injected possibly for the first time in this way into American political discourse and religious discourse. That year, 1979, Muhammad Abdul Rauf also began participating in seminars on religion and political economy, and he began translating Islamic traditions under the auspices of the American Enterprise Institute. Not only was Novak a crucial figure in the white ethnic revival that I mentioned, in the late 1970s, he and AEI President William Baroudi, who was this Lebanese Christian immigrant, enlisted Muhammad Abdul Rauf to join Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish intellectuals in outlining a broadly monotheistic basis for the anti-socialist neoliberal model of political economy that they were promoting. And the result was that Abdul Rauf contributed not only to the book I mentioned, Capitalism and Socialism, a Theological Inquiry. He actually published a separate book with AEI called Muslims' Response to Democratic Capitalism. And that was devoted to Islam's compatibility with American market liberalism. Now, he didn't see complete convergence between Islamic precepts and American political economy. He had some criticisms, but those criticisms don't show up 30 years later in his son's work. Faisal Abdul Rauf does not refer to his father in his 2004 book, What's Right with Islam. He doesn't refer to his father's work. Rather, while replicating some of his father's ideas without the critiques, he replaces the Arabian locations of intellectual and interreligious exchange that were central to his father's Arab-centered progress history, like Baghdad, with a center of culture more recognizable to American and other Western audiences, and that is the city of Cordoba, the European city, of course. Although it's now European, it was, of course, under an Islamic caliphate at the time that he's talking about. So to recap, the story of American exceptionalism, assimilation, and upward mobility and moderation that Rauf told before the Cordoba House controversy repeated a narrative created by earlier immigrants and their descendants who emphasized the same ethics, including work ethics, as dominant white Protestants, as well as the moral obligation to engage in community service so as to assist those who fail to succeed in America's free market system while not putting that responsibility on the state. This is a narrative earlier generations of immigrants and marginalized racial and religious groups used to prove their loyalties at a time when they were suspected of having uncivilized mores or communist sympathies. But it's also a narrative that perpetuated the fiction that white Americans, whoever was included at any particular time in that category, and of course it changed, have experienced upward mobility because of their own efforts in a meritocracy, rather than because of the kinds of social capital connected to whiteness in the United States, and equally important, because of the 20th century government-funded social welfare programs that aided whites and white ethnics, but largely excluded non-whites. In short, this argument has served, among other things, as a way for marginalized groups to distinguish their communities from dispossessed Black Americans and other quote-unquote undeserving poor. Or, in the case of Black Americans like W.D. Muhammad, who is the leader of the former Nation of Islam and who echoed this narrative from the 70s until he died in 2008, to distinguish themselves from the supposedly undeserving poor in their midst. So in other words, Rauf's optimistic appeals to American history about immigrant assimilation and his attempts to render Islamic traditions familiar to non-Muslim American audiences replicated, while actually obscuring, the ways many earlier marginalized religious groups learned to claim belonging in the United States, ways that invariably involved contrasting their own traditions to those of less accepted populations. And failing to recognize this dynamic, Rauf also failed to fully appreciate the political, economic, and racial positioning involved in his claims to moderation. Now, although Rauf did not personally hold to the racist belief this older narrative perpetuates, or even recognize that it perpetuates them, he did begin to tell a somewhat different story after the Cordoba House controversy. And that was in part because the controversy coincided with a recession so severe that it made painfully apparent some of the economic and racial inequalities built into neoliberal free market capitalism in the US, at least to anyone who was paying attention. Rauf's 2012 book, which came out after the controversy, was written in part to defend his work after that debacle, bears a great deal of resemblance to the 2004 book that I talked about here. But there's one crucial difference, and that's that he no longer mentions democratic capitalism. And there's this whole expansive version in his 2004 book about how wonderful corporations are that is also missing. Instead, he spent and spends more time talking about his international work to promote good governance and Sharia compliance, and also emphasizing Sufism, which was his main project prior to 9/11, his main interest in the subject or the reason for being of his other main organization. He stopped emphasizing Sufism as much when he started working on projects involving international Muslim authorities, and we can talk about the politics of that later if you want to. However, even though Rauf no longer emphasized Sufism, his defenders during the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, particularly his non-Muslim defenders, all rushed to remind non-Muslims that he was Sufi, and therefore he was moderate, and therefore he could not be a militant or a radical. In fact, in the New York Times in 2010, William Dalrymple wrote an opinion piece saying that although Rauf's take on Sufism made him sound like a Muslim Deepak Chopra, those are Dalrymple's words, Sufis were in fact moderate Muslims, and they were ideal partners in combating Islamic extremism. I should add in closing that Rauf was aware of at least some of the possible pitfalls of enacting the role of moderate sought by the US government and others. But he was also keenly aware of the ramifications of being deemed immoderate. After 9/11, long before the Cordoba House controversy, several worshippers from Masjid al-Farah were summoned to police headquarters and interrogated about their lives and their histories and their relations and their practices. And some who I know personally had their phones tapped and their homes ransacked by the FBI, all without warrants. Others, I'm told, simply disappeared. And although the extent of the National Security Administration and New York Police Department's invasive surveillance campaigns, not to mention federal detention efforts, would not become clear until nearly a decade later, Rauf had begun working with the FBI as early as 2003 to try to dissuade intelligence officials from categorizing all Muslims as possible terrorists. And these weren't things he generally discussed in public. Caught between desires to defend his community from immediate threats and to be accepted by non-Muslim elites who could improve that community's situation in the long run, He acknowledged in a contribution to a debate over moderate Islam that the term moderate Muslim is problematic. Those are his exact words. Nevertheless, whether he recognized it or not, he continued with endeavors that built up the reputation of some Muslim Americans at the expense of others, Muslim and non-Muslim. And even still, working with the US State Department to promote America abroad and working domestically to promote democratic capitalism as authentically Islamic and authentically American didn't protect him. During and after the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, his life was threatened multiple times. And even political conservatives who shared his ideas labeled him an extremist. This, unfortunately, reveals some of the limits of moderation, of enacting moderation for Muslim Americans. And it also reveals the limits of American liberal inclusion, limits that other religious minorities have faced in different ways at other times. And I'm just going to leave you with a reminder of most of you don't remember it, I don't remember it, I wasn't born either, but a reminder of the presidential election of 1960. We now look back on Kennedy's election as a watershed moment, as monumental for Catholics in America, and that Kennedy overcame deep Protestant bias to ascend to the White House. Rarely now do we talk about the rise in anti-Catholic nativism and the vitriol that accompanied his time in office. And I can also talk about that later if you're interested. In the decades following Kennedy's assassination, anti-Catholicism remained a live force in politics, just as it had been before. And this trend only subsided somewhat when Ronald Reagan, fulfilling the hopes of presidents since FDR, but hopes that presidents hadn't been brave enough to undertake, flouted Protestant nativism and established formal diplomatic ties with the Vatican. This was not something that came about because of Catholics' own attempts to prove their patriotism, as much as it did by international political concerns during the late Cold War. If anything, actually, acceptance of Catholics increased as politicians raised the specter of a new religious enemy, which was so-called radical Muslims. These historic American politics of inclusion raise serious issues for Muslim Americans who seek to repeat what they believe have been Catholic and Jewish paths to inclusion. Not only have such attempts to gain acceptance proven ineffective as of late in some quarters, tragically, they also risk repeating a pattern of gathering some into the national fold at the expense of others, be they racial others or religious others. Rather than replicate such dynamics, some Muslim American groups have begun to recognize them and to challenge what they see as the highly racist and deeply biased, religiously biased parameters of inclusion. The results of their efforts remain to be seen, but one thing we know for sure, they have their work cut out for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this incredibly richly textured and nuanced argument. I think we'll just, I'll field questions for you since there's so many people here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ibrahim. I'm doing my PhD at the French Institute of Geopolitics. I'm actually studying the surveillance of Muslim by the Americans. That's the core of my work. And I was wondering, so basically, like Imam Raouf was kind of close to Mayor Bloomberg after 2008 because he got like huge support from him.
Mm-hmm.
But was it easy for him to negotiate like between that relation and his own legitimacy with the basis of the Muslim community after the Associated Press revelation on the surveillance of Muslims?
Can you state the last part? What is? Can you form it as more of a question?
I mean, like, was it like easy for him to negotiate between like his proximity to Bloomberg and his actual legitimacy with the basis of like the Muslim community, while there were like revelation about a secret program?
Yeah, right. The proximity to Bloomberg was in some ways less of an issue than his distance in general from other Muslim communities, which was a factor after 9/11. He and his wife Daisy Khan, who was the executive director of the Asma Society, which was the other organization that worked in cooperation with the Cordoba Initiative, they were very close to religious elites, of non-Muslim religious elites, and it was often commented on by other Muslim American organizations and communities that they spent far more time making alliances with non-Muslim religious elites and far less time listening to what was going on within the broader Muslim community in New York. So that, I think, was more of a thorn in their side when this happened. And there was actually, after the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I think, or maybe it was 2010, there was a larger gathering where, at this point, Rauf was no longer involved in the Cordoba House project, but its developer, Sharif El-Gamal, goes to this majlis, this gathering of broader Islamic organizations in New York and actually more broadly, and apologizes for basically not consulting anybody, not being in touch, and like trying to not rally the ranks, but trying to at least establish relations that hadn't been there before. The Bloomberg thing, that I think, if that was problematic, and it might have been, and I don't know about it very much, was probably less problematic than their closeness to Ray Kelly, who was police commissioner. That was the one that was really rough to deal with. So I didn't see that being successfully navigated very often. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, hi, I'm Catherine Spellman, and I've been based in London for the past 25 years and looking at Shia Muslims in basically in Europe and the UK. So I just moved to New York for a few years, so I'm so fascinated by your talk. And I'm just curious about Rauf's relationship with other Muslim leaders and organizations, and how he dealt with the politics, especially with his advocacy of capitalism, and how he dealt with borrowing money and interests, and with the rise around the world of Islamic finance and Islamic banks. How did he navigate that?
He wasn't as involved in conversations of Islamic finance as far as I could tell. As far as relations with broader Muslim leaders, he was very close to the Aga Khan and many of the Aga Khan's foundations, and spent some time cooperating with them on different things. And this was something that that sometimes didn't go over quite as well at his mosque. People weren't. What I found at the mosque was that people were usually on board with the interreligious stuff. They had a harder time with the interreligious stuff. So Sunni relations were more difficult for them than were like Muslim Jewish or Muslim Christian relations. But his arguments about democracy and capitalism, there's a large subset of American Muslims, and I imagine international Muslims, who echo them. And so that was the world that he mostly moved in, and it didn't seem to cause him very much difficulty. What sometimes could cause a little more difficulty was the promotion of Sufism, which many Islamic legal authorities don't approve of. Not all, of course, but there are plenty out there who do not. And as he began to try to build relations to establish an index of what constituted Sharia-compliant good governance, that emphasis on Sufism threatened to be problematic. And it was around that time that he stopped talking about that as much. He didn't stop practicing himself or leading his Sufi group, but it certainly wasn't at the forefront of what he was doing at that point. Did that?
And yeah, that's very interesting. And just to follow up, did Novak and others, did they ever refer to Max Weber's work?
Oh, sure they did. Yeah, that was actually an interesting thing. They think that Max Weber was completely wrong about the iron cage. That it's a golden opportunity, not an iron cage. Yeah, they do.
Go ahead.
Shahada Rahmatullah, University of Jordan. I really enjoyed listening to your talk.
Thank you.
I look forward to buying your book and reading it. And I appreciate how you've contextualized it for the American context, and I appreciate the value of that. And I think I have more of a reaction rather than a question,
Sure.
to be honest. Right?
Sure.
I think moderate Islam is also very, very much, as I'm sure you would agree, a global phenomenon as well, right? So
The discourse around it, the attempts to promote it, yeah.
Yeah, so for example, like I teach at the University of Jordan, the Amman message, right? A common word between us and you was a letter of interfaith unity.
Right.
Signed by 100 Muslim scholars from across the world to the Pope. I think of the Wasatiyya movement across the Muslim world, which poses itself as quote unquote the middle way. And I say middle way because who gets to decide what is middle, right?
Right.
Who gets to decide what is moderate? And particularly this usage of Sufi Islam as the face of a good, loving, peaceful, law-abiding Islam is something that dictatorships throughout the Muslim world routinely deploy to discredit serious opposition movements like Islamist movements, right? So my reaction was that there's a very global dimension to that as well. But again, I appreciate, the importance of contextualizing it in the
We work on that in a different context, and on that global dimension. You're absolutely right. And I think, forgive me if I'm quoting you incorrectly, I'm not quoting, but paraphrasing Kathy, one of the concerns about this is the way that not only that it gets deployed by dictators, but the way that it endangers Sufi groups in different communities who are then seen as proxy for U.S. interests, and begin to be taken as proxy for U.S. interests around the world. So yeah, you're right. It's absolutely global.
And if I could just briefly add, I mean, that's such a tragedy in terms of the manifest anti-colonial history of Sufi movements, right? For example, I mean, in Libya against the Italians, it was Sufi tariqa networks that allowed mass anti-colonial mobilization, right?
And in other places in North Africa, it's at the very least deeply ironic that some people choose not to recognize that, yes. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned something near the end. I was wondering to reiterate it. I didn't quite catch it. Something about how there was sort of a give and take between being moderate so that one could work with social elites, and also like perpetuating the idea that like white American social mobility was meritocratic. But how like moderatism perpetuates that. But there's also the need to sort of give into that pressure to work with people who can.
Yeah, that's the difficulty that the difficult situation that I think he found himself in. And I'm not trying to argue that Rauf that he was solely strategic in the things that he was presenting, because he grew up in a pretty rarefied environment and he believed much of what he was presenting. I'm not going to say much of. I think he believed all of what he was presenting, but he was also aware that there were communities that differed and that there were other issues that were posed, even if he wasn't aware of the racial history and extent of this, which if you compare his 2012 and 2004 books, it becomes apparent that if he wasn't aware before, he became notified about those disparities by 2012. Even if he wasn't aware of it in its full extent, there was some inkling for him, but he knew, he moved in very rarefied circles, and he wanted to be the person that was able to extend a certain kind of message and portray Muslims in a certain kind of light, Muslim Americans. And yes, that is the perpetual bind. But as I mentioned, there are plenty of other groups now, and there's one that comes to mind is this recent collective, the M-Power, and it's M-Power for Muslim Power collective that is raising consistently social justice concerns, including issues about police brutality, issues about economic injustice, things like that, while they're also defending Muslims as quintessentially American as anybody else. So there was this pressure, I think, especially after 9/11, and Rauf was not the only person caught in this bind, but more and more people, especially younger Muslim Americans, are rejecting that bind and saying we can navigate outside of this kind of situation.
Can you explain that a little bit more? The nature of the bind and what kinds of navigations you're seeing?
Yeah, the nature of the bind is that if you don't articulate a certain message, then you don't get to play with certain political figures, so you don't get entree into the arenas where you could actually change opinion, right? So there's this kind of like, you have to buy in or enact a certain position to some extent in order to even be heard. And this is what I describe in my larger work as pressure to conform to what are often Protestant-derived norms, or norms derived from Anglo-Saxon Protestant circles in the United States that have been very influential. So this pressure is something that we see some younger Muslim communities, Muslim American communities, rejecting. And this isn't just a recent thing. There have been, communities like the Inner City Muslim Action Network, which was founded in Chicago in the 90s, that has been rejecting this consistently for 20 years. And then there's this recent Empower collective that I've mentioned. But it does mean being kind of like the Bernie Sanders supporters within the Democratic Party, right? It means like sometimes they get into the position where it feels like you can't not listen to them, but nobody's necessarily happy that they're there. So it's a tough spot to negotiate. Yeah.
Just, I keep coming back to the parallels that you were making, this push towards the oneness about this notion of belief, unicity of God, and then to this broader universalism. And I haven't really thought about it, but what I'm trying to understand, because it is coming from Muhammad al-Iraq, is this a universalism that we often see as sort of a defense mechanism from the besieged minority community? So there's deeper, bigger truths, or particularly because of the lineage of the Abdul Raufs, it's just sort of something that's almost coming from within the tradition, like a sort of a poor reading of Ibn al-Arabi and this sort of pantheistic notion.
I don't think it's Ibn al-Arabi because Muhammad Abdul Rauf writes this when he's a student at SOAS. It was basically his thesis at SOAS. And so his advisors are like Gibb and, not Thomas Arnold, people of that ilk who are of that generation of Orientalists. And it's not Gibb directly because Gibb wasn't at SOAS, but he was in London at the time. So, and that's who he's citing in his narrative. He's trying to take the narratives that all these Orientalists have already created and retool it to include Arab Islam. So it's, there could be this other aspect that you're also talking about that's underlying that, but Muhammad Abdul Rauf was certainly not going to quote Ibn Arabi. I mean, he was serving as an Egyptian functionary in some ways, and he's not going to, be promoting the pantheist Sufi. That's not going to keep him in his position. And I'm not trying to suggest that he was compromising himself in any way. I don't know that he was actually Sufi or had Sufi sympathies, although he seemed to have no problem with his son being Sufi and seemed to support him in his endeavors. But if there was this other aspect of reading it from within the tradition in certain sources, he was not really in the position to be able to his Orientalist mentors, his particular Orientalist mentors, or to his government officials to be able to make that case. So, yeah, that's a good question. Because he's not anti-Sufi in his writings. He's kind of just a little ambivalent about them. Yeah.
And he does have this ijaza in Sharia. So
You mean Muhammad Abdul Rauf? Yeah, not Faisal Abdul Rauf. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Faisal, out of context, I don't think that was questioned. It's coming from a scholar.
Right.
There makes.
Yeah. Yeah, so just to clarify, Faisal was not officially trained in Islamic theology or Islamic law. This is something he always attributes his education to, an informal education with his father, like basically typing his father's thesis and things like that. So.
I'm Nana, I'm a sociology student from MIT. I have one question that's just very general, perhaps you said it in the beginning, I missed it. I was just wondering whether you would say a bit more about, because you mentioned you do kind of ethnographic work, but then I think it was a lot of working with the text as well, so how that worked together in your research. And the other question was, you mentioned basically kind of how Muslim communities need to navigate these kind of norms and political establishment. I would like to know whether you think there has been an important change in the ways that politicians or the government changes, because I mean they also need to navigate and make choices who they talk to and get a sense. Do you think they have a good sense to start with of basically the variety of opinions that are out there, and then they are kind of conscious where to place their different conversation partners? Or do you think there's kind of an absence of knowledge and then they just pick the first person that sounds kind of attractive? And whether there's a change in that kind of their understanding and navigation?
Yeah. So there's two different questions. The first question is about dealing with textual research and ethnographic research. I think there was a rule posed after I graduated that no dissertations could ever be as long as mine was again. So that's one problem with dealing with both at the same time. And it was also my colleague Erica Dyson who did the same thing. That was complicated. It really felt all-consuming for a period of about 7 years. It was just like trying to manage both of those things was more intense than I had anticipated. But thankfully it evolved into the material of a book and then several articles and maybe enough for another book, we'll see. But the other question is a really good one about, not that the first one wasn't, but a really good one about change and in what branches of the government, this might have been, because the Department of Homeland Security, I don't think so. I don't think there was, much change in that respect. The White House, absolutely, when it went to the Democratic Obama administration, he appoints Ibu Patel to the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood partnerships. I hope I'm saying the right one, because Bush had one and Obama had one, and the names are a little bit different depending on whose administration it is. But so he starts including Muslims, and in 2009 he goes to Cairo and he's like, we're unveiling these broad community service initiatives to bring Muslims and Christians and Jews together. So he's very keenly, has been very keenly aware of the need to be more inclusive, and that was definitely a change from the previous administration, not just in the tokenism of it, but in recognizing some of the diversity of it. I'm not sure so much about the State Department, if they were as savvy about that as he was. I mean, Obama has had with multiple different community groups, including Black Lives Matter activists and all sorts of different community organizations. So there have been opportunities for him to hear, and for White House officials to hear from different sectors of the Muslim American community. I'm not sure that the State Department has been doing the same thing, because they usually choose people that are going to reiterate a certain narrative when they go overseas. And so there's less room for flexibility in that, I think most people within the State Department feel. It remains to be seen how temporary these changes have been, because the next administration is a little bit up in the air. And be it Republican or Democratic, I wouldn't swear for the savviness of either one of them on these counts. So.
Yeah, in fact, your description of some of Ralph's mistakes reminded me of the Democratic candidate.
Yeah.
So hanging out with elites. And
Yep. Yeah, exactly. I'm not even going to talk about how much time Ralph spent at the Clinton Global Initiative meetings when that still existed. But yes, there's some kind of parallel there. Yeah. Question?
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on, you said we could ask you in the Q&A about Citizens United.
Oh, yeah.
And given the way, that's such a fun part of the story, the way the sort of waxing corporation just sort of drops out of this, and what becomes sort of plausibly moderate in the context of recession and everything. So if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I didn't know about this until I read a portion of Jane Mayer's new book, Dark Money, about Citizens United, about the Koch brothers funding KOCH, of course. And what I didn't know was that in 2010, which is the rise of the Tea Party, but it's also the first election cycle. It was midterm elections, not presidential elections, but it was the first election cycle in which we felt the impact of Citizens United. All these political action communities, or political action corporations? What's a PAC? Committee, thank you. They started deploying funds for races in key states where, whether or not the quote-unquote ground zero mosque was an issue there before, they made it one. They used it, all these political action committees, to kind of sabotage Democratic politicians who may have never even made a comment about the issue before, but they had, and this is particularly like Americans for Prosperity, a Koch-funded network. They had videographers just ambush them and say, you said this about the Ground Zero Mosque, and don't you think? And the person's like, I didn't say anything, but I think it's a local municipal matter. And then there's this big tirade on some commercial about how they support terrorism, right? So the way that issue went national was not just because of the issue itself. It was because all of a sudden there was this ability for conservatives who already dabbled in this in the 2008 election with charges against Obama to deploy this on a national scale for the sake of local elections. And that helped greatly fan the fires there. Yeah.
okay, I think we should wrap it up. So.
Great, thank you again for coming. Thank you for bringing your class.